All right, so thank you for attending and participating in this comprehensive exam review. Pardon my somewhat raspy voice, kind of getting over, what a lot of us have gotten this viral season, let's call it, here in schools and whatnot.
Mm,
So I want to talk about really how to thrive in the program and specifically on the comprehensive exam, and not just pass it, right? So it is a pass-fail option. Um, but it's really going to be indicative upon how well you understand the content, and then in some ways be leveraged to how well you're going to do on your dissertation project itself. So if we look at this second slide, a lot of times people ask me, how do I study for the comprehensive exam? Or why do we have it to begin with? Well, historically, we used to have a portfolio where that was our way of assessing or evaluating how well did you meet these 6 different metrics that are important for the state of New York. And first, it was difficult to keep up with and evaluate every single semester from a faculty standpoint. And from a student standpoint, I don't think it actually assured that you had mastered not only the content, but to be able to articulate that content to other people. So in an applied way. So that's part of the reason why we shifted about 4 years ago back to a traditional pen and paper test, even though this one's typed and you have to get it completed. So I present here an 80-20 split of you have already done 80% of the preparation that you can do for this, meaning you tried really hard in your research classes. You thought about and have conducted already research projects in various literacy classes, thought about your dissertation topic, so on and so forth. So a lot of the work has already been done. And so that leaves you with 20% of what can be done this semester in preparation for the comprehensive exam. As I'm going to walk through, basically detailing a more elaborate version of the email that I sent a few weeks ago, talking about what is comprised within the comprehensive exam. So you may remember from the email, much like our course sequence is structured, you take a research class along with a literacy class almost every semester. So this semester you guys have pretty much finished that. Some of you are in mixed methods, but most of you have already taken that. And you're in 3292. So you've taken 5 research classes. The final one, where you learn more about mixed methods, in particular, talk about research design. And research design is kind of putting it all together within an umbrella-like framework so it makes sense. So, for example, what would not make sense is if I said I wanted to do an ethnography and go into, let's say, studying Aboriginal literacy learners in an Australian context, and I only want to look at it quantitatively, right? So that doesn't really make sense, right? So the research design of an ethnography lends itself towards qualitative data collection by and large. Sometimes it can go into mixed methods. So there has to be an alignment between your overall research design and what you hope to be able to accomplish in that setting. So let's start off talking about research questions in particular. So research questions, we see these a lot in the literature, in journal articles, as well as our own projects and potential research questions for our dissertation projects. And oftentimes you can tell what kind of study it's going to be based upon the wording. So for example, let's say that you have a research question that said, what's the relationship between fluency and reading comprehension score? Okay. Well, when I use the word relationship, I'm talking about a correlation. I'm looking for basically a linear line of, perhaps a directional hypothesis that says as fluency goes up, so does reading comprehension score. So that's one way to think about your research question is very telling about the project beyond just what the question is. It could tell more about the methods, it could tell more about the theoretical framework, et cetera, et cetera. A directional research question, if I were to tweak the previous one, would be something like, is there a positive relationship between X and Y, fluency and reading scores, reading comprehension scores? So that's when you go into these hypotheses, which is the next really bullet point there. And there's a time and a place for it to be directional like that. So is there that positive relationship that I anticipate? And there are other times for it to be non-directional because you don't know or you don't want to make those assumptions. So let's say, for example, that you're doing an experimental or a quasi-experimental study, and you're looking, and your school has a brand new reading intervention for those who find reading challenging, let's say in second grade. And you let's say that you wanted to test the effectiveness of this intervention on a group of people, and then test the control or the traditional instruction with another group. Excuse me. And you don't really want to assume that the new intervention is going to be better. So what I would do there is I would say, for this comparative study, you could say, you could say that my hypothesis is that, or I could just use the null hypothesis that students will not score higher in one group than another. You know, so you could use a null, you could use an alternative that's more of a directional. It really just depends upon the purpose. When it comes to theoretical frameworks, it's my opinion that this might be sometimes an overall weak area for doc students in any program. And I think it's because it's all foreign. It's not something that you've seen in many master's programs or whatever else. We talk about it a lot in 3282. We touch on it elsewhere. But in terms of an applied standpoint, I think we could do a better job at preparing you for that. So as a result, I've had Olivia Stewart, who teaches that class, to be able to prepare a voice walkthrough PowerPoint where she presents lots of different options for theoretical frameworks, why you would want to consider them, and how they could match up with overall methods of data collection analysis. So I'm going to share that resource with you later today. But just as a quick primer to that, the theoretical framework, you want it to be explicit and you want it to be really situated in your particular study and not just literacy in general or not just education in general. I'll give you a counterexample. Somebody could say, we're going to be looking at teacher methods of literacy instruction in an urban school district, and I'm going to connect that or use a theoretical framework of Vygotsky's scaffolding. So even though scaffolding could work, it's kind of a general education theoretical framework that's not necessarily situated in just literacy. So one way that I could take that framework and meld it into literacy particularly would be using the gradual release of responsibility model that Gallagher and P. David Pearson came up with in the 80s, where they talked about how do we release the responsibility and scaffold students along the way. So that's one way of taking an idea that's situated in literacy that comes from a larger theoretical framework of sort. So the more precise and explicit you can be, the better. There's some theoretical frameworks that are actually theoretically based or abstractly based. Others are developmental, like Piaget's stages of learning, or some are more conceptual, meaning somebody came up with this idea or concept or model, but it might not have been tested out a whole lot yet. So again, it really just depends upon the purpose of your study. We're also going to ask you to determine what is your rationale for that selection. So one mistake that some people do in their dissertations is they say, you know, I want to do such and such a study in some schools, I want to collect this data. And my question to them is, well, why do you want to do it that way? Right? Why is that the right theory? Why is that the right research design? Why is that the right research question for this project? So if you can't rationalize or explicitly articulate that, then you need to think about how does that theory really match your particular study. Because sometimes more than one matches. In fact, I was reading a dissertation proposal last week, and somebody had 3 theoretical frameworks that she wanted to use. They all fit, but it's going to be overly complicated to analyze that data through 3 different lenses. So we basically said, throw out 2 of them, stick with the one that you think fits best. It's not the more the merrier. There are a number of sampling methods that really was discussed primarily in 7211. You could do a quick refresher of that on Google pretty easily, from some that are more standardized to ones that are less so, based on convenience, based on criteria, based on random selection, et cetera, et cetera. So have a look at some of those options. And again, you're not going to be asked what are the best ones. You're gonna basically be asked what are the right ones to investigate such and such a topic. When we talk about research design, that word, and this is really important for you to focus on. Most designs have a specific tag name that goes with it. So for example, let's say that I said I want to do a correlational analysis of the relationship between fluency and reading comprehension. That is a correlational study, and that word correlational tells you that it's a quantitative project. Similarly, you could say it's a descriptive study or a causative study. So a causative would be the causation, which you see much less of, which could be done through regression, et cetera, et cetera. In your mixed methods class, you talked about probably 6 different methods. I know I made that class a couple of years ago, and I taught it a bunch. And so there are 3 different sequential models talked about in that class and 3 different concurrent models talked about in that class. So have a look at those. If you're not familiar with that, send me an email and I'll try to send you some PowerPoints. Qualitatively, there's typically 5 different kinds of research designs. The most popular 2 are case studies and ethnographies. You also have narrative designs, phenomenology, and some other. So again, make sure that the research design that you're talking about right here really is the one that answers your research question. So for the same reason that I wanted you prepared in qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods to be able to answer whatever research questions that you have at that time, if I were to give you a research question here, I want you to think about what aligns itself back to that question, because that's the most real world example that you could ever have. Is you're a teacher in a school, you don't control all of the random variables, you're in that situation, and you want to be able to investigate certain subject matter. This is how you do that. You start with research. The means of data collection, sometimes people don't know what the heck I mean by means of data collection, but it's simply what are the variables that constitute data, right? So where are you getting your data from? If we're dealing with quantitative projects, typically that can be third party or public or governmental databases. You can have test scores, you can have surveys if you look at those quantitatively. In qualitative realm, you have many different options there too, from interviews, observations, could be surveys if you look at them from that construct, oral histories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They could be focus groups and so on. So I think you're much stronger on this than maybe the theoretical framework. But again, I think that PowerPoint is going to help you with that as well. One challenge historically for people on this comprehensive exam is when we talk about means of data analysis. So I'm going to send back out later tonight a stat flow chart that I use all the time in 7211, second quantitative class. And it basically starts at the top with what kind of research question are you trying to answer? Is it a descriptive? Is it a causative? Is it a correlational? And then so on and so forth. And you go through this flow chart to be able to select the right kinds of data analysis techniques to answer those research questions. I would encourage you to refresh your knowledge of that chart. You don't have to have it mastered, but I think, let's say that you should know 50 to 75% of where to go on this chart, and that'll put you in good shape for this conference. Before I move on, the point is not to memorize all of this. The point is to have enough familiarity so that you can do a quick refresher 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and you can actually accomplish this important work in your particular educational context. That's the goal. I have reminder books all around me on my desk. I'm looking at one right here. It says Statistics in Plain English, a book on dyslexia, a book on the IELTS test for working with international students. We're not expected to have mastered everything, but I want you to have enough, what do they call it, like a meet the minimum threshold for moving forward in these realms. So that's the first part. The first part is on that research design. You're going to have, from recollection, I think 5 days or so to be able to do that portion of the test. Then we go into the literacy essay, which is more or less about a 20-page essay, some of which you may have written in some context and can be used for this purpose, but it has to be situated in this particular setup. And I'm not going to fully flesh it out until the day of the comps later this month, but I'm going to give you a walkthrough using my dissertation study as an example. So for this literacy essay, there's going to be 4 parts. The first part is, what is really your definition of literacy for the purposes of your study? That's one part that I was ill prepared for when I did my comprehensive exam. And I presented my proposal, and a guy said, well, define literacy. And I was like, and I came up with something. And he said, oh, so it doesn't include digital literacies? And I was like, well, I didn't say it did or it didn't, you know, you're just trying to stick it to me in this setting right now. So you really want to think about, how do you define literacy for the purposes of your study? So my study that I conducted in 2006 was on looking at rural versus urban reading instruction in a 2nd grade classroom to see what are the geographic factors and nuances related to rural and urban areas that shine through in the instruction from sort of a sociocultural lens. So when I think about the history of my topic, one could say, well, why did you select rural versus urban? And it was because I identified a gap in the literature at that time, where there's a lot of research coming out in urban areas. There's a lot of research comparing urban and suburban. There was a little bit of work in rural areas, but there was never anything comparing rural to urban. And so I thought that that could be a gap that I could further look into and maybe add to the extant literature. So if I wanted to talk about the history of my topic, I would probably look at policy, so sort of acts of legislation related to educational factors, going back probably to the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965, and I would probably bring it all the way forward through next generation standards here in New York or whatever else that might be relevant to your content. So the reason that the history is so important is unless you can showcase how your topic meets the gap and how it is situated based upon the history, then you can't be assured that it's original at all, or you can't be assured that it's actually timely or relevant. So take, for example, if somebody just didn't know about the Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965, and they only knew about the newer version of that same law, they might not understand why it was revisited, why it's somewhat different from the Common Core or No Child Left Behind, and so on and so forth. So my dad always says a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, and I think it makes sense where, it's like if you know a little bit about the stock market and then you start making moves, you're probably doing yourself more harm than if you knew nothing at all. So thinking about the history of the topic is really, really important. Talking about your study in this literacy essay, you're going to talk about how it extends from, supports, or maybe is a point of difference from other seminal researchers in that area. So let's say that somebody who recently came through was talking about they wanted to look at African American adolescent boys and their literacies in urban areas. And I said, well, whose work are you really looking at in comparison to that topic? And she couldn't tell me people like Alfred Tatum in Chicago or David Kirkman here in New York. And it's those kind of people's work who is so influential in that space that you have to be familiar with. Showing that you're not means that you haven't really looked at the history of the topic or the currency of those cultural currencies that are incredibly popular today in that particular. The potential implications that can be incredibly varied. We don't have to go into that a whole lot today, but implications can be on teachers, students, families. It can be on policy. It can be at the school level, the district level, et cetera. It could be in higher ed. It could be K-12. It could be K-5. It could be whatever. So specify what the implications are and how does your study really potentially add value in that space. So the resources, again, that I'm going to share, Kyle Cook prepared a really amazing sort of matrix and look at research questions and making sure that those are directly aligned within tables I often use to make sure that, let's say, I want to answer, I want to do an ethnography, let's say in rural and urban areas. I want to do some observations. How am I going to analyze those observations? I'm going to do Spradley's participant observation guide to do it. So it's sort of right there across the board. You leave nothing to question from outside readers, and it all sort of makes sense. Again, I'm going to share that stat flow chart that you can review, and Olivia has created a really good and thoughtful theoretical framework, which is again kind of one of those tough areas to kind of put your mind into that space unless you're really well read on that topic. And most people don't pick up the theoretical models and processes of literacy, when they're going to the bar on Friday or hanging out with their family, watching a football game on Sunday. So those are less well read for doc students in general, and that's probably why it comes as a bit of a learning curve. What I want to do now, before the Q&A, is I want to send out a new link to all of you so that I don't shortchange anyone, because this link, for whatever reason, is telling me where it's going to end in 2 minutes. So I'm going to send out a new link through Allie in just a minute. So I would ask that if you have some questions for me, if you'd like to engage in that conversation, I'm going to try to record it as well. So I will try to do that in just 1 minute. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so I'll try to send that right out, and we'll be right back on here in just a couple minutes. See you soon.